Let's get started. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and please introduce yourselves in the chat, so we have a sense of who all is here, and how you're gonna commemorate May 1st. And with that, I'm gonna hand it over to um, Ahmed to get us started.
Hey everyone, we're recording, right? Yes. Hey everyone, how's it going? So I'm Ahmed Mori. I am the co-director of the Community Ownership Learning and Action Lab at the University of Miami. Really excited for this installation on our ongoing Cola Lab webinar series with our partners at COSIT, the Community Ownership Stewardship and Impact Table. Um, Really happy to be here with you all, and thank you for making it out, particularly on May Day. We are very excited to have this conversation today. You'll be hearing from one of our Cola Lab partners, Transform Finance, who is working on quite a bit of research and strategic documents with regards to how community ownership practitioners on the ground can engage with different capital actors as they seek to launch and sustain community ownership projects on the ground. And we'll be hearing from our partners over at Bridgespan. Our relationship with Bridgespan was a study that was commissioned by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in partnership with us at the University of Miami to explore the possibility of capital aggregation as a tool for largely, but not exclusively, national philanthropic actors to support the community ownership field. And so this particular lens shaped the focus of the feasibility study that they produced, which is now available publicly on the University of Miami website and presumably soon within the Community Field Notes website. Looking at Paul, you'll hear about that more for all the folks who registered. You'll hear about it, in COSIT's follow-up. So very excited to hear from them both. We have Athurv Sinha presenting on behalf of Bridgespan and Kurt Lyon presenting on behalf of Transform Finance. We're going to take about 10 to 15 minutes to hear some presentations from each of them, and then we'll engage in a fireside chat that I'll be moderating, and then we'll leave some time open for questions at the end from all of you who are here in attendance. So with that, I will pass it to Athurv.
Hey everyone, good to meet you. I'm a manager at the Bridgespan Group, supported both University of Miami, funded by Robert Woods Johnson, and understanding whether aggregation was going to be a useful tool in this field. We did a couple of things. What I'll talk through today is both the research that we went through, some of the insights from the folks that we talked to, and ultimately where we landed on that kind of big animating question of is aggregation going to be a viable tool to increasing new financing for the field of community ownership? So I'm going to quickly share my slides and we'll just jump straight into it. So, as I said, we were really animated on this question of what is needed to drive net new forms of capital. In our initial conversations before we even jumped into the actual research itself, what we were hearing from almost everyone at different points is the work when we talk to the people that we're supporting, the people that we're in community with, is really powerful. It's changing lives in different ways. It's enabling stability for folks who've not had it before. However, we are not able to get access to the capital that we need, and that problem manifested in a number of different ways. So what we wanted to do is essentially look at what are kind of the creative ways that you can start to solve this problem, of which one is aggregation. The way we kind of evaluated this question is we looked through kind of the entire existing base of research that there was on the question, both looking at what has happened in community ownership in the past, but then also looking at what happened at other analogous fields in the past 20 or 30 years and how they leveraged different tools. We interviewed a number of field leaders in the space, and we also interviewed a number of folks who kind of represented the sources of financing that would be needed. And then we did some big kind of group stakeholder sessions with field leaders and funders, all culminating in what we call an impact lab, which is really just a very, very long meeting where we kind of take the question and we really break it apart in a bunch of different ways and see where everybody lands. And that out of that process emerged essentially two different forms of financial aggregation. So one of the things you'll hear me talk about a lot is everyone in this field is doing it for slightly different reasons. Sometimes they're really similar, sometimes it's not. Sometimes folks really care about decommodifying the land that they're on. Sometimes folks are interested in wealth building. Sometimes folks are interested in regional economic development. Sometimes those are the same thing and they're completely compatible goals with one another. And sometimes they're not, and there's tensions that exist amongst them. And navigating those is a really critical form of something we needed to do to actually honestly evaluate the question. But essentially, from all of that level of difference and all of these folks with different goals and priorities, we landed on what were essentially two core forms of aggregation, which we'll jump into pretty deeply later, but I'll just give the slight overview here. A first, there's a number of kind of locally rooted organizations where the intention at no point is to turn this into like a big national organization that owns thousands of homes or different kinds of properties, but the intention is to be rooted with that community. And it requires a set of supports that kind of wrap around, both in terms of philanthropic capital, but then also in terms of supporting with things like the back office. On the other hand, there's a set of organizations which are kind of aiming to make community ownership this thing that people in every community are familiar with and recognize and is a part of what they do and doesn't feel like an unfamiliar option to them. And for them, there's a different kind of infrastructure that needs to be in place. There needs to be ways to tap these larger capital markets that are much bigger sources of capital. And both of those kind of are two fundamentally different goals. But before we jump into it, we'll kind of start with like what was the central insight. So as we discussed, there was a number of ways we jumped into this kind of concept of, oh, you can cut the field in a lot of different ways. Like people have different goals, they operate at different sizes, they have different needs. And what we ended up landing on is like, frankly, I think the most pragmatic approach to just really simplify some of this. And it is like, what are your core needs? And can we bucket those into a couple different categories? So when talking with field leaders, we tested a couple different frames, and where we ended up landing is on this one that you see right here. And this is the primary way that you'll see us talk about the field. It's definitely oversimplified. It definitely does not represent all of the different shades of gray, but this is the one that everyone felt like, yeah, I can at least 60 to 80% agree with that. Well, with many of the other options, people were at 20 to 40%. So essentially, all we did is we looked at what were the core problems you face. So like on one hand, you have smaller hyper-local efforts. These are organizations that are often rooted to one single neighborhood or one single city. Their funding is often different kinds of grant-like capital or philanthropy. And raising that comes with its own set of challenges. And then at the same time, because you are intentionally operating at this smaller scale, and it's very much a core part of what you do is being in relationship with that community, having really strong things like back offices or technical assistance is really, really hard to achieve. Generally, to get kind of the different levels of talent that you need for those and the different levels of support, it requires like a lot of capital and a lot of people to get it to where it needs to go. On the other hand, we had these organizations which were seeking to operate at some kind of national scale. They were making the case that essentially this could be something that works with the market at some point, but people don't understand us and they don't want to fund us. And that creates its own set of challenges. So they may not have a track record, which they may not have the balance sheet that they're looking for, and they may not even have the relationships to access some of the kinds of financing that they need. So all of that would need to exist for them. And then second, there was a almost level of we have to operate in a market with commercial developers that do not care about things like extraction and they do not care about things like maintaining affordability within a home. How do we compete with that from the financial perspective? How do we set ourselves up to deploy capital at the same rates they can, at the same premiums that they can, in the same kinds of asset classes that they can? And to us, these two things felt quite distinct. They were distinct sorts of problems that needed to be solved in distinct ways. And what we also saw is, interestingly, there's ways to kind of cut the field and see how some of those patterns emerge. So people generally resonated with like this kind of very high level data. So what I'll say here is this is directional. Almost all of this is going to get updated, particularly as like some of the more detailed surveys mapping the field go out. But essentially, we kind of saw one key thing, which is by number of organizations, there is significantly more local, kind of very place-based actors. There's a big gray area that tends to be about 50% of the space, but by dollar size, there's significantly more big players. The insight that we walked away from all of this is it means that both of these are really big segments of the field in two different ways, and any solution should address both. You can't really pick one or choose the other. The reality is you have a field that's this big spectrum, and you got big chunks at either end. And solving that kind of creates its own set of complexities, particularly because these organizations are funded in different ways. So all this slide is showing is different kind of capital stacks across those two segments that I talked about. So what you see on the left is the big buckets of capital that we categorize these projects, capital stacks as. So you have grants, grant-like subsidies, you have below market return impact capital. So this is stuff that generally requires you to pay it back, but often has terms that look very different from what a traditional market actor like a bank or a large pension might offer you. And then you have your entire bucket of things that's just like traditional financing. This is the kind of thing that you would get at a bank. What we see is with the much more locally based actors is they traditionally rely on the ones in green much more, while the more national actors traditionally rely on the ones that are blue much more. This sets up a little bit of a challenge because all of these three types of capital, so grants, this impact capital, this bank financing, all want different things. So philanthropy is generally looking for some kind of impact or some attachment to a strategy or some attachment to a place that they care about. So it's much more mission aligned. It's also, in a way, has much more friendly paybacks. However, there's not that much of it. It's not very easy to raise. It's often very fragmented. There's no single source you can go to come get a lot of philanthropy, which is really often needed when you're talking about things as expensive as acquiring houses or commercial developments. While for impact capital, they generally do tend to look at impact, but there's check size mismatches where essentially they want to deploy in the scale of 10 to 20 million versus many of these developments can be at the scale of like sub 1 to all the way up to 5 million. While with low cost traditional financing, it all comes down to can you meet the return and the risk thresholds we have? And that creates its own set of problems. So these three types of capital are not well matched to work well together, but they often have to in this space, which creates its own set of complexities. So that's a lot of data that we just threw at you. And this was our best attempt to summarize it over the course of the project, which is essentially at the sources of capital level. So this is like your impact capitals, your grants, your financing. There's a lot of money out there, but all of that money has completely different needs and they vary by who those individual funders are, which creates a ton of complexity for any individual organization. If you flip to the other side of that, you have more than 300, likely significantly more than 300 initiatives, all designed around bespoke goals, and they should not have to really compromise those goals, especially as they relate to the community. And then because those goals are all bespoke, they all require slightly different kinds of capital. So essentially, you have two things that have different needs. And one of the only ways to kind of solve for both of those sides is to have some kind of institution that can balance those field needs with what capital needs in a way that can actually increase the amount of capital that's available. So that was our central case for why aggregation is needed. Where it gets a bit complicated is when we start to think of, okay, so then how do we solve for that? If you need aggregation in this field and you have these things with different segments, different needs, and on the other side, you have sources of capital that are different, your goal needs to be unlocking capital for both of those segments, which creates its own set of complexities. So where we landed, this is the last thing that I will say before we'll pass it to Kurt, is we essentially landed on two parallel solutions for the two distinct segments of the field. So if you have these two segments and they both need two very different kinds of capital, that are not necessarily complementary with one another. You essentially need two different solutions that could work in parallel and then make them complementary. So our solution was you have two aggregators, as I was saying at the top, one that is focused on the smaller hyper-local efforts. The goal is to take this kind of really scattered philanthropic ecosystem where you have to go rely on one local funder and one community foundation and one national funder that wants to give you a much bigger check size but doesn't really understand why it has to do a small check size into something simplified and easy to understand. But we use the term field catalyst for a reason. It's jargony. But what we are meaning is it provides supports that are much greater than just capital. There is a number of things organizations need, from technical assistance to back office functionings to capacity supports that'll strengthen their ability to work, especially at the small hyperlocal level, so that aggregation doesn't end up compromising values or needs. On the other hand, you need a tool that can create the capital markets infrastructure for these models that want to make community ownership this proliferated national scale kind of thing, where it's as familiar to us as a mortgage is. That requires a whole range of capital solutions. It will likely require experimentation with different kinds of financial vehicles. While on the other hand, outside of even the capital that it provides, it will need things like standardized reportings and benchmarks that make community ownership kind of legible to someone that works at a bank. You will also need different kinds of data, different kinds of market education, because a lot of this is showing investors what is already true about community ownership, but they just don't know yet. So that was our big final recommendation that we walked out with. There's a number of nuances, details, which we'll get into to us throughout the conversation. And Kurt's going to add a lot because he's actually been kind of jumping into what do people actually think in terms of the data itself. But I'll stop there and pass it over.
Thank you so much, Thur. That was wonderful and a lot to summarize in a very short period of time. Uh, yeah, so I'll pass it to you, Kurt.
Sweet. All right. Are y'all seeing my screen okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Yes, hello. Great to be here. This is like one of the nerdiest webinars I've been on in a while, which is really fun. I always love hearing the way that you and the Bridgepin team break down the research that you've been doing. It's always like it's always so clear to give something to respond to. So I'm excited for the conversation we have later and for the questions coming in. So I'm the executive director of Transform Finance. For those who aren't super familiar with us, we're a nonprofit that creates insights and actionable strategies for all the stakeholders seeking to really make finance more transformative. We do a lot of work in the ownership space. You might be familiar with some of our work in employee ownership. We're doing a bunch of different things to build out capital markets for business conversions of different governance models. But more broadly, we've worked across a lot of different issue areas, really trying to find ways to push impact investors, philanthropy, and those who are kind of in a position to use their capital more catalytically to figure out like what are the actual pragmatic ways to do that. We have these three principles that we apply across all of those different areas, which is community ownership, non-extractiveness, and then fair balance of risk and returns. That's really central to all of the work that we do. So, a few years ago, started talking to the folks at U Miami, Ahmed, Gretchen. I saw you're in the chat about this really kind of critical moment in the field of community-owned real estate, and we use this acronym CORE, community-owned real estate. So that's what it means when you see that. So we're participating in the Cola Lab project to really dig into those financing needs, the gaps, the challenges, what opportunities, what solutions are being developed. Kind of like in a parallel track as a third in Bridgespan, we're doing this deep dive into the aggregation question. So I'll try to skip over some of the stuff that we looked at that a third has kind of already touched on. But these were our main research questions here, and what we really were trying to solve, and are right now creating some different kinds of materials for both community leaders and the finance side, which is looking at their capital stacks, looking at the process of decision making that leaders on the ground, project leaders actually go through. What trade-offs, what decisions do they make that folks who are stepping into this space need to consider when they're trying to start, building something new in their community. The different types of capital providers, as Athurv said, each capital provider has their own very unique special needs. They are all snowflakes in their own way, and they have their different, opportunities and sticking points. And then, yeah, what are the solutions being developed that can maybe mitigate some of those challenges? The work that we're doing is really trying to inform all of these different players that come together to make community-owned real estate happen, not just the capital, not just the community leaders. As we'll discuss, philanthropy funders, they have a really important role in filling both capital gap needs, but also just kind of greasing the wheels with like technical assistance, operations support. Without funders, knowing how to play their role most effectively, we're like all of these potential capital solutions won't be held up. And then a big, kind of observation that we had is kind of the separation of the impact investing market and the community development market. You see impact investors like family offices, foundations on their endowment side, or using PRIs, high net worth individuals, kind of operating in a silo. Whereas on the other hand, you have like community development, financial institutions, CDFIs, government agencies like housing authorities, kind of operating in their own lane. So one of the questions is how do you kind of bring these folks together to develop the right capital stacks? So I'm going to get into some of the just like a high level overview of the findings that we had when digging into community and real estate financing. These are kind of our observations talking to lots of different practitioners on the ground and on the finance side. Coming off projects that typically need some sort of catalytic or subsidized capital to work. That's our primary area of interest, and I think we'll get into that later. I'm excited to that when we kind of have more of a conversation. But yeah, thinking mostly those projects at a community level who are really stepping into creating something new, not necessarily building portfolios or replicating a model at like a regional or national scale. So, what makes core financing different than, to typical housing or community development investing? These are a bunch of different factors right here. So you have all of these pieces operating in a competitive returns maximizing market, and that makes it legitimately challenging and difficult for some of these projects to do what they want to do. The permanent affordability that a lot of models have just straight up changes the math and economics on what kind of revenue is going to be generated from a real estate deal. You don't have usually these projects kind of buying, holding, and selling an appreciated asset later on. So earlier investors are not going to have that liquidity event. So there's kind of a complex system of refinancing and long-term investing that's needed. The cost of doing community ownership is real. There's technical assistant, tenant capacity, all that organizing. There needs to be some sort of subsidy, whether that's in terms of grants or subsidized investments to keep that. That's the most important piece, right? That's why we're interested in community ownership. Um, and getting to the scale question, a lot of what's happening at the local level it is not really at the scale of LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit deals, new market tax credits. A lot of the existing capital that theoretically could be deployed for community ownership is just not really flexible enough to operate in this space. And I think trying to be creative around that is really important. I know UHAB, which does a lot of work with housing cooperatives, is trying to figure out how to um, uh, get more LIHTC applicable deals to housing co-ops. They just put a paper out on that earlier this year. Um, Community-owned real estate projects typically don't have existing balance sheets that they can use as collateral or like use to leverage into loans. A lot of these are new organizations, not existing portfolios or kind of like staple community developers in their communities. All of this stuff really just narrows the funnel of what kinds of investors are interested or kind of used to this. A big piece of our education goals is to, kind of make the case that this isn't as scary as it seems. It's not as risky. But when you don't have as big of a funnel, it's really difficult to, acquire capital uh, quickly enough. That I was having fun this morning, so I added this need for speed. But there is a real need for speed, and when it comes to capital, to acquire properties in a competitive market. So the way that we like to think about the different needs, which kind of emerge organically from our conversations and surveys of capital stack development, is actually looking at it from the perspective of phases. So those who are used to, affordable housing development or real estate development, this will be familiar, but these are kind of typical phases when doing different kinds of development projects. And with community ownership, each of these phases comes with its own unique needs and challenges. And the reason we separate it out by phase is that these are all very important inflection points where specific types of capital are needed. Specific types of investors are equipped to provide that kind of capital or are used to it. And there are, very unique gaps when it comes to these different phases. So I'm not gonna, kind of read through all of this, but I'd say overall, pre-development and acquisition tends to be the phases that we see kind of like the most need or the most lack in terms of available capital. Again, for acquisition, you need to raise capital quickly in order to put an offer down. Otherwise, they'll sell to a more traditional investor or developer. And then, especially for new organizations, it's often really hard to just straight up get someone to trust in your project and the vision to do that planning, feasibility, designing the governments. There's a lot of consultants and contractors that need to be paid. That's something that traditional developers, kind of have down pat. Like there's very clear systems in place, but the newer project is the less familiar that they're going to be with that. So here are kind of the key challenges for each phase. Again, I know we want to get to the conversation, so I'm not going to kind of go too deeply into each specific piece. Um, but I talked about pre-development and acquisition, construction and rehab. That's where that balance sheet piece comes into play a lot. Like not having the ability to guarantee a loan is often a big reason that a project will get turned away from, say, like a regional bank or CDFI. And then in terms of permanent and takeout financing, there's really just a lack of long-term affordable debt. This is the kind of financing that helps pay down the acquisition and pre-development loans or construction loans. But again, because most of these community ownership projects are not, seeking to flip the property for kind of a return, this debt needs to be super long term. And the revenue being generated from a permanently affordable project is not going to be as much as if it was floating at market rate. This capped rents, which is super important for community land trusts and a bunch of other models. And then a really important piece for this operations and stewardship phase is, this is kind of where having a cash reserve funds this ongoing staffing, technical assistance, doing building repairs. But most of the time, projects are not, they don't have that big reserve. They're not pulling from a broader portfolio of projects too that are all generating revenue and kind of sharing resources with one another. So that's also something where philanthropy often needs to come in even after a project is, acquired and converted to, do that ongoing governance funding. So here's a few other structural barriers that we see kind of repeating over and over that are general, not really just applicable to a specific phase. So obviously, we talked about intermediaries and aggregators. There's really a lack of those even at the local level. I think later I'll get into some of the ways that community leaders are starting to build local intermediaries and portfolios. But it just kind of means that there's a lot of reinventing the wheel and not, experience and systems sharing across different projects. Um, Speaking of, information sharing, underwriting templates, a lot of these are kind of bespoke and unique. Each project is also pretty unique in how they design the governance and their timeline and everything. So at this point in the field's development, we don't really have that standardization. Some places have a lot of public funding support, and I say a lot, but this is kind of comparative to other places. If you have a city or county government that has some funds, say for acquisition or for longer term permanent financing, it really is transformative. We've talked to projects in Los Angeles where LA County has a land bank program that put up, I believe, $25 million for projects that fit in this community ownership umbrella. And there are projects that are completely acquired and converted through public funding. And in other places, that's not even a consideration. So that really makes this like cross geography aggregation difficult in some way because the needs, not even in terms of type of project, but just what access to resources they have really are variable. There's philanthropy that also is kind of spotty in different places, but I think long term, it's difficult to imagine relying continually on philanthropy for that operating support. And then just generally the impact investors, again, those family offices, foundation endowments, high net worth individuals, who could be providing that, say, unique financing terms like equity-like capital, long-term debt at a concessionary or catalytic rate, are few and far between. So that was a lot of the challenges. Not to say that there aren't really amazing solutions being developed. So I wanted to list some of them here. So these are some of the ideas that we've heard that I think are really worth investigating. So aggregation, of course, talking about that today. Um, there are kind of conversations and work happening right now to develop some kind of bond or fixed income product that could kind of tap into the bond and debt markets. Again, the standardization issue across community ownership makes that a challenge. But if we can figure out how to access those kinds of stable debt investors, it could really unlock a lot of capital. There's this idea of social speculation. I have to credit Saul Etlin, formerly of Community Vision, for introducing me to this idea. But it's kind of the idea of buying a property that is market rate and you allow it to appreciate, and then say after 7 or 10 years, then there's a preempted and designed conversion to community ownership. Obviously, that really delays the benefit of community ownership, but that kind of approach would unlock, in the early stage, kind of the more conventional development capital, because for the early stage investors, it looks the same. They're putting in some kind of debt or equity that's going to get paid back within, 10 years. And then, to them, they can just, they don't really care what happens after that, right? National guarantee pools, when we talk about intermediation, that's another important piece that, always comes up. That could be public or philanthropic money that, would enable or kind of like help ease in some investors who have, trepidation around community ownership. I think there's a lot to be gained from learning about places like Los Angeles that have received public investment. Several cities have acquisition funds or different programs, either directly or through nonprofit partners that are managing programs and deploying city funds in very specific ways in the capital stack. Typically, yeah, we see that in acquisition. There's a really, really strong case to be made for municipal and county governments for why this is an important concept to back. We have heard a lot of discussion of cross-regional community land trusts or real estate investment trust structures. This is basically a type of aggregation, but looking at shared back-end services. An example of that being in California, the California Community Land Trust Network is really robust and does a lot to kind of like aggregate resources at the state level and support local projects. And then lastly, I think one thing that we are interested in doing is really looking at those underwriting frameworks and like legal frameworks to create some kind of standardization to introduce new lenders to community ownership. I think that's something that really could, be the thing that pushes, say, like a bank or CDFI from saying no to saying yes, if there's kind of this easy underwriting product and framework to get behind. So that's where I want to stop. I think we'll get into a bunch more. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you are interested in learning about this stuff. We should have a few materials coming out in the next month that summarizes a bunch of this.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Everybody, please join me in giving both Thurv and Kurt a round of applause. The work you've both done is incredibly helpful and strategic for an emerging community ownership field that's going through a very broad set of growing pains. And especially as we gain a better grasp of the needs of both community ownership practitioners and capital actors, which is one of the themes that I heard in both presentations. Understanding and solving for the kinds of bottlenecks that Thurv identified and how to bridge actors, as Kurt, you started to speak to a bit, it really points out the complexity of this field, how to solve for forms of capital that don't always work well together, the mismatch between existing sources of affordable housing subsidies and community ownership, a lot of the relational underpinnings of capitalizing projects, and even how projects focused on decommodification still need to grapple with fast-moving and speculative real estate markets. So with that, we have some time for a fireside chat, and then some time for audience questions at the end. So I'll get started with a Thurv. So a Thurv, a question for you. I'm very curious about some of the potential positive externalities that could come from aggregation. In addition to routing capital to projects on the ground. Can the existence or how can the existence of one or multiple aggregators either catalyze additional capital community ownership projects or in some other way help grow the field, such as potential roles for intermediaries?
Yeah, so Britspan about like a decade ago started just doing a ton of research into movements and fields and kind of just trying to backtrace. There's like all of these familiar success points to us, like the movement for marriage equality. We have this like large Supreme Court case that kind of decides everything. And the question is like, how did they happen? Like what led to these changes? And the reflection I keep coming back to is there's a lot of things that are almost, it's like when you look at like a night sky when there's no no pollution blocking it out, which I think for many of us who live in cities is a little rare nowadays. But when you actually look at it, there's like all these little dots all over the place is a little bit how most fields are. And then what happens is they start to become effective when they turn from just like these dots to these like dense webs where they're all interconnected, where like someone's drawing these lines and making them constellations and making them work. And typically there's a step change that happens where you have like all of these dots, and then generally it's a number of organizations that are essentially like, we're going to work better together if we're collaborating, even though we share different goals and we're different populations. And these are almost always unruly coalitions full of many different people who believe different things. And when that starts to happen, you kind of get this alignment that moves things forward. So like what I hope is that a tool like aggregation starts to draw the lines between this like very fragmented group of funders that all want slightly different things and starts to get them to not just be more efficient with whatever they were deploying, but start to get the case of we should deploy more towards this issue, especially because when we talk to these leaders in other parts of the constellation, like it's really exciting, it's really impactful, it means a lot for the people that are here. Like that is my hope of the positive externality, even ignoring whether it's able to deploy more capital.
Thank you. No, and that's wonderful. And I think, understanding generally the role of something like an aggregator and its intervention in the field um, is important, right? Particularly as we see field dynamics evolve in this space. Kurt, a question for you. And a third presented earlier on one of the findings from the study was this typologization of community ownership capital stacks on the ground, right? This range from heavily subsidized grant-like subsidies to below market rate return impact capital to heavily market-based, more traditional financing with risk-adjusted returns. And there's a bit of a discussion in terms of how models of aggregation can serve projects across that typology. So, Kurt, you started discussing this a bit also as you guided us through the specific challenges of financing community ownership. And I was wondering, through your data collection, through your analysis of capital stack details among projects on the ground and your experience generally doing this work, what additional nuances would you or could you add to this typology? And how does the work you've been doing complement or complicate the view that projects lie on this spectrum? And what else maybe should we think about when we speak of the off bespoke needs of these projects?
Yeah, well, Arthur, as you know, there's so many ways to slice and topologize the projects that are out there. There's this like multi-dimensional matrix that I wish I had the tools to visualize. But generally, I do think that thinking about the two buckets that Arthur presented is really helpful. One piece that does add a wrinkle is there are place-based projects that do have portfolios or funds, which to a national impact investor or funder looks pretty similar to whether to like a regional or national intermediary. And we actually see that happening more and more, where folks on the ground having a hard time raising capital from local impact investing markets and local community development lenders are starting to kind of like package products so that they can go to different markets and actually access non-local capital. Kensington Corridor Trust is a good example of that. They're really on the national impact investing circuit looking for program related investments. The Guilds Fund in Atlanta is another example. So, in one way, it's kind of looking one way to see it is like are folks raising for one-off deals that you could kind of pull together from either different investments in one place or even across different geographies, or are they bundling kind of under one umbrella at a place-based level, like say a community land trust that raises money for an acquisition reserve that can purchase multiple properties under one roof. We've seen that happening in Boston. So like an alternative topology is looking at say like small one-off acquisitions and conversions, larger projects like say larger commercial projects like mall acquisitions, for example, a concessionary portfolio like Kensington Corridor Trust, or a closer to market portfolio, which could be place or non-place. And there's a few projects like Rock USA spun out a fund. Ground Solutions Network has a fund that would fit in that bill. So I think the place is particularly important when thinking about what kinds of investors are potentially interested. But you can have portfolios at a place level that kind of expand beyond geography. And I guess one piece that I really want to reiterate when thinking about this spectrum is we need to be comfortable with the fact that there, is a need for concessions for many of these projects. Really, the stuff that Transform Finance is interested in really bolstering, I think we'll always need some kind of philanthropic or subsidized funding. And not necessarily trying to pull those,
Mm.
to the right, so to speak, but actually kind of leaving them, in their bucket and figuring out how to get the right kind of capital for them.
Thanks.
Completely agree with that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I appreciate the call to sort of normalize subsidies because that was so much of the conversation at Third that we were having like throughout the feasibility process. So back to you at Third, but Kurt, also any reactions you may have to this. I'm curious about gaps that would need to be filled for the various models of financial aggregation that you all have been thinking through to be successful. So first, within that, there's a question of how we define success, but also what are the capacities necessary or desirable beyond capital aggregation and deployment that an aggregator and/or community ownership projects would need to generate or strengthen for aggregator models to find that success. And speaking to Kurt's presentation also of the challenges faced by community-owned real estate projects, how broadly across the spectrum of financing phases can or should aggregator models operate, right? What can an aggregator cover?
Yeah, so these are all, I would say there's three questions, and they're all really good and really complicated questions that could each have its own hour of discussion. Um, to me, in terms of success, I think the biggest way to put it is there are certain goals that should not be compromised, and they're driven by the organizations themselves. If you are local and place-based, you should not be put in a position to accept really expensive market capital and be less affordable and serve less of the needs that you are responsive to. And on the other hand, if you are someone who wants to make CLTs exist at a national scale, should be able to try and do that and not be forced down the line into one other direction. I think that to me is what success looks like. And what it means is that an aggregator must inherently be narrow. Like it should serve a specific thing and leave things that are not its remit to other people. I think kind of the archetypal example I'm thinking of is often when we look at these community-based projects, it's not that they have trouble raising all capital. It is that you can raise certain kinds of capital and other ones are hard. And often it ends up being like a very specific tranche. People sometimes refer to this as like, oh, like you need the catalytic capital that goes and unlocks everything else. But as like an example, if you can show a project is viable by being an early commitment, whether it's philanthropic capital or whether it's like very, very low rate debt, you can kind of cover just 10%. And then everyone else in a local community or at a national level will say, okay, like someone's put some early capital and I trust it. That to me is the big gap that exists across everyone is there is this need for this almost like 0 to 3% return capital that exists both at the local level and even at the national level in some cases if you need that in these blended finance models to make it work. And if you can find a way to fill that kind of gap, it unlocks in a lot of other tools. But outside of the capital side, I think the big thing at the local level is some of these back office supports are actually much more meaningful than we give them credit for. Like if you can have really strong, almost like HR, finance, budget teams, like community program management, that's really hard to like think about. You're supporting a community of like what is essentially going to be like 20 homes for 20 families. Like having those four hires is really expensive and really hard. But if you're looking at six community land trusts in the same city and now you're supporting like 300 people, like you can have those same staff kind of operating in multiple different areas, supporting multiple different organizations. And I think to me, like that's like it's a very underrated need that people kind of I don't think is like this is a sexy thing to fund, but is like an awesome in terms of actually unlocking people's time and capacity thing to do. So that's my maybe my ranty answer that like covers half of everything that you said.
And I completely feel you on it because one of the findings that keep coming up in that the way that we pose it in the University of Miami case study work is sometimes forgetting that we're financing and funding ongoing organizations. That and it's to your point, it may not be necessarily as glamorous or as sexy as funding specifically in acquisition. There are ongoing operational needs, right? It's not a limited life organization. Kurt, did you have any reactions to some of the stuff that a third was talking about?
I I completely agree. I was gonna try to lift up the need for support for local ecosystem stewards, kind of like the quarterbacks in their community to be resourced to think about this problem of aggregation or maybe the solution of aggregation. The organizations who are trying to do this are stepping in to fill a need, but aren't, historically, the ones who are, equipped to develop financial, infrastructure. But we need those to be the people who do it. So yeah, having support, I think, is the most critical thing for those orgs.
And so a question for you, Kurt, is, there are ways to think very expansively about aggregation functions. Instead of aggregating capital in some ecosystems, we can see to the point that you were just making about ecosystem stewards, we can see intermediaries who make deals happen, bringing together different forms of capital and almost aggregating, using the word again, but in a different way, capacity needs for projects on the ground. So, in your view, I want you to maybe kind of expand a little more on what you were saying actually about ecosystem stewards or intermediaries or and it's a sign, by the way, of an emergent field that we all have sort of slightly different terminology for these actors. But how can we be more strategic about identifying these folks across place and ensuring that they can and continue to serve as conduits between projects on the ground and the capital needed to launch and sustain them?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's the way to identify these folks is to talk to the people who are doing community ownership on the ground. And, Transform Finance and CCI, Center for Community Investment, did, a small gathering for the folks who are filling that ecosystem steward role. And because this is such an early stage field in terms of, identifying as a field and sharing practices, a lot of folks might not even see themselves as being that rock, that linchpin in their community, but they are. And it can look so many different ways. There's organizations providing technical assistance support. There are just like, community land trusts or kind of like, multi-property projects that, are kind of like the go-to in a given community. And I think really to identify and strengthen this, there kind of needs to be this, some kind of network support, experience sharing, and just like socializing a lot of these concepts so that the folks who, are the unsung heroes in their community are recognized as such. I think these are kind of the fun early field challenges to address because it's really about lifting up the work of folks who like are not being acknowledged, especially by national funders. And there's a place component to that. It's not surprising. It's not that funders want to know who these folks are. So I think, yeah, the more we build networks, like what the one COSET is doing, the more opportunities we have to do that.
Third, any reactions to what Kurt was saying?
I I think that this entire point of like networks, dense webs, identifying as a field is completely agree with all of this. Is there's a kind of like we were talking about with the Brisbane field research, there's like a little bit of a progression, and we are at that stage of people are actually just starting to see one another as in the same group, in the same community, and then as those things turn into these dense webs. And then frankly, like when organizations like Transform Finance can publish awesome research on how you guys are actually, we're the same people, we're on the same team. I think it just helps move things forward a lot. And we just need to see kind of more of it likely for the time being. If we have a couple years of just getting everyone up to the same place of we're in this together, which is maybe a little kumbaya, but I think it's a nice place to be.
But it's a good point, right? I feel like it's one of the key initial underpinnings of field formation and field theory is beginning to identify with this field. So I think all three of us are sort of getting to that point in different ways. I have one more question before we open it up to questions from the audience, and this one's for both of you. So in this emergent field, we see, as we see across the spectrum of community development, there's also here a perennial debate about the mismatches between the priorities of projects on the ground and the priorities of philanthropic institutions. And so I was hoping if you'll indulge me in like a little bit of role play here. A third of you speaking from the vantage point of the Bridgespan study and to some extent philanthropy, and Kurt, maybe from the vantage point of your work, understanding the needs of projects on the ground, capital needs of projects on the ground. From those vantage points, what are some of the structural issues at play that kind of complicate this debate a little bit? And what ideas do you each have to overcome these structural mismatches? And I know this is a super easy question.
Yeah, I hate this question, but I can try and answer it. I think that this is kind of maybe the underlying core that makes all of this hard. And there's like a part of me that goes to an idealistic place of the answer is generally you have to change the structures of philanthropy and the structures of markets to make it work. And then there's another part of me that's like, that's a 40-year project. The answer is you have to find a way to make it work with what you have now. And then that requires wrestling with really, really hard trade-offs. And those trade-offs tend to generally be there are priorities a community will hold, there are things that capital will need, and those are not the same thing. So where are you willing to compromise and where are you willing to change? To me, one of the biggest structural mismatches is just this, what return are we okay with giving and at what scale from funders? So this 0 to 3% thing that everyone in the field wants is unfortunately the smallest tranche of capital available at any given moment. It's easier to raise grants and it's easier to raise market capital. But that 0 to 3 tranche that we think is catalytic is kind of the thing that everyone wants, which is a really hard, complicated place to be. So then the question is, how do we get that and what are we willing to change to get something like that? Do we want to jump into the capital that a market might offer, which then tends to be double or triple and come with restrictions? That feels like a compromise that can be too much sometimes. Or do we want to figure out some ways to maybe reorient parts of the organization? So this is like where we get into conversations about like, we don't want to change the structure of governance in our community. However, we are totally fine doing kind of due diligence templates and being in community with certain kinds of funders and operating in that way. Like that might be a compromise that your specific organization is willing to do. And it'll likely look different for everyone. But I think that that ends up being the crutch here is the structural issue is that there is a mismatch. And all of us are trying to find different ways to solve it. I think some of the blended capital stuff where you lower the amount you need of that 0 to 3% capital is one really excited way to do it. Another exciting way is figuring out these different the dimensions which you are willing to make changes on, like how your back office operates, or whether you fit in with certain templates or certain models of standardization. And I think that we should all every organization will need to come to the decision in a different way, but everyone should like identify where are the things that are bridges too far. Is it our governance? Is it the fundamental affordability covenants that we provide? Because it'll look different for every community. But that's my pragmatic answer. And then the non-pragmatic answer is maybe a conversation for dinner and drinks.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that idea of compromise and concession and who does that and at what point and to what degree. One interesting thing that we've seen is when a project emerges from community and starts doing acquisitions and conversions, typically they start out being very, very specific about, look, this is our model, this is what we want to do. And they go to market and, oftentimes we'll get closed doors if that goal just doesn't fit with the needs of funding or lending, but they kind of stick with it and then find those kind of hidden gem investors who are able to do that, like really scrappily looking for state and local funding opportunities, whether that be like discretionary funding or getting some kind of community ownership lobbied into new legislation. And then as a project continues and starts to do more deals, I think we see a level of maturity in terms of just understanding markets and the fact that funders and investors and lenders are typically not that flexible, which again, this is something that needs to be pushed on. They can be more flexible, they can take on more risk, but it's interesting to see interest rate goals say like moving from okay 0 to 3% for the first few projects, but then as you are doing more, it's like you know what we might need to figure out a way to tap into that 5 to 8%. I think a good example of that is Chicago Trend, which does commercial acquisitions for community ownership. In their first round raise, it was mostly that PRI level, and then their second raise, they opened up to more, yeah, conventional terms for CDFIs and community development lenders. It's tricky because like we don't want to have to make concessions on the community side because every basis point that is tweaked in terms of the type of capital raised, that does have real ramifications for how much money you're going to be able to have for technical assistance. What is your rent cap formula? How long would it take to get residents in apartments to get their co-op share? um, you know, these are real trade-offs that project leaders need to face. I think one piece that would be really useful to have is like, and this is something that we're trying to work on, and I know you Miami is too, is like what are those decisions and trade-offs? Because you don't know what you don't know, and every project comes up with its own specific challenges and unique solutions to those problems. But I think skill sharing and experience sharing can help, preempt some of those. And then on the flip side, I think when talking about philanthropy, again, like the dollars that are available for community ownership in philanthropy is not what we would want it to be. We would like more, but there's the real question of like what is the highest leverage of philanthropic dollars. I think it's really worth thinking about partnerships from a funder side with other institutions like CDFIs, like local governments, to use funding for, explicitly pilot programs to say like, hey, we'll foot the bill for this innovative, unique project in the Twin Cities, but we want this to scale, but we can't always be the one who does that. And there's a real watch and learn piece that happens in a lot of these kinds of innovative, impact investing fields, where it's really the first ones who are doing it that are taking on all of the risk, and figuring out like failing first so others don't have to fail in some cases. Philanthropy needs to be really good at identifying what those opportunities are. To your question earlier, Ahmed, about like, how do we find these? I think really being in tune with local funders and local developers that have eyes on the ground is super important. So some kind of network or like opportunity spotting, or cohort fellowship for funders who are interested in this. There's real skills in figuring out what those opportunities are. And local communities know what they are. There just needs to be kind of a bridge in dialogue.
Thank you both so much for that. We've had a few audience questions come in over the last few minutes that I'd like to read to you all. The first is from Vivek. So, Atharv, what is the scale of investment that you'd imagine would be required for the initial 10% low return debt you highlighted in your last answer, which I'm guessing was an answer or two ago? I know it varies wildly by project, but are you thinking that 100,000 would be viable for many projects, or thinking more 1 million plus? I'm just trying to wrap my mind around the order of magnitude for the need, or maybe what scale that you think might be the highest impact.
So maybe this is my consultant bias coming out, but I do love back of the envelope math. And when we were working pretty directly with Ahmed, one of the things we actually did do is try and do some of the like really high level directional estimations of on the supply side, how much capital is there even available, especially in that tranche? And then on the demand side, if we were to take some really ambitious goals, like we want a 5x or 10x community ownership and how it works, what would you then need? So for this kind of low return capital, the challenge is organizations use that kind of capital in different ways, like we were showing earlier with the capital stack. So if you have some organizations that are literally 100% of the capital they've raised, so if they're buying a $1 million property, $1 million is 0 to 3%. Um, Low cost, long-term debt. And then there's others which essentially use that as like a catalytic layer that can be as small as like 5 or 10%. So it's not an easy thing to like paint a very broad brushstroke of what you need at the single individual level. But from our calculations, if you were to do something very ambitious, like try and 10x the amount of community ownership there was, assuming everyone's project stays the same, it's like in the order of you need more than $1 billion. And that's 0 to 3% capital unlocked. And the challenge is right now, the total market capital that operates at 0 to 3% at those long-term rates is right about $1 billion. So you would be essentially saying that either we fully displaced every single what you might call like catalytic capital or impact first investment that exists with community ownership, which is like part of the pragmatic thing that we start to jump into. But again, that was our very broad brushstroke, back of the envelope type of math informed by a little research. So I'd say it's much more directional. There's probably some pretty big confidence bars on it, but it is somewhere in that order of magnitude.
So we have a few minutes left, and I really want to try to get this question out. And this could be for either or both. This question is from Riss. I'm very interested in the underwriting. I think community-owned real estate underwriting standardization could help funders tap into a workforce market that can't own single-family homes. This could channel their rent expenses and savings/investments into their community for smaller multifamily collectively. See it as a major market win because it's a group of people who are not able to access the right housing product for their income/savings. Selling this idea, new customers who just need a different finance/ownership product, should be something banks should be jumping on if they had strong underwriting solutions. I'm curious how underwriting standardization might roll out, or how much of a priority it might be.
I can jump in. I mean, two challenges come to mind immediately, which is, we talk about community-owned real estate or, different buckets. Within buckets, within sub-buckets, like these projects look really, really different on the ground in terms of their, revenue model, the timeline to completion. Some projects are, building ground up. Some are just kind of rehabbing existing buildings and doing a conversion process. Each one of those, is kind of unique from a financing perspective. So when we think about underwriting those deals, we really need to compare apples to apples, and that's something that I think is possible, but like we don't have the data on every project that's happening. And we're still early stage, and like we should be experimenting and trying to find new ways of doing this as opposed to just falling, in the order of one type of project. And then secondly, a product that banks are happy to jump on like sounds amazing, but that means that underwriting template also needs to fit their risk and return and timeline quality criteria, which kind of gets into all of the issues with the mismatch in project investor needs that we've discussed. Oh, you're on mute, Ahmed.
I'm on mute. So that about wraps us up. Thank you both so much. It's really, truly a privilege to work so closely with you both. And I'll pass it back to Paul and Lucas to close us out.
Thank you all, and thanks to Thurv, Ahmed, and Kurt for sharing this research. It's great to see all these questions come in, so please give them a virtual round of applause. Yes. Yeah. We really appreciate your participation. We would also like to direct your attention toward the Hilo. This is a platform for folks like yourselves. This is where there's a community of like a resource sharing platform. This is where we share events, share resources, etc. Um, we'll put that link in the chat here. Yeah, this is how you can also stay in touch with us. Um, we'll share uh, other our contact information, etc., through various follow-ups, as well as a recording of this webinar. Um, and with that, we'll let you all get on with your day.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Have a
Thanks,
great
everyone.
day.